Hello and welcome back to Thecrimereel. Today we shall be visiting the life of Barbara Graham, also known as Bloody Babs. On June 26, 1923, a baby girl named Barbara Elaine Ford was born in Oakland, California. Her start in life was far from ideal. Her mother was an unmarried prostitute and her father was unknown. When Barbara was just 2, her mother, who was still only a teenager herself, was sent to reform school, leaving Barbara to be raised by neighbours and extended family. As she grew, her life became a series of orphanages, foster homes and convent school. Barbara received little education and soon fell into a life of trouble, promiscuity and crime. Just after her 14th birthday, Barbara was sent to Ventura State School for Girls, the same brutal institution where her mother had also been an inmate. In 1939, Barbara was released and tried to make a new start for herself. At the age of just 16, she married Harry Kylehammer, a US Coast Guardsman who was 10 years older than her. She enrolled in a business college and gave birth to their first son in 1940 at the age of 17. This was quickly followed by a second son. However, in less than 2 years, Barbara and Harry were divorced, with Harry retaining custody of the children. With this attempt at a more normal life failing her, Barbara became a prostitute like her mother before her. During the Second World War, she became a seagull, the name given to prostitutes who flocked in pairs or groups to nearby naval bases. Despite a couple of further attempts to bring normality to her life, working in a hospital and as a waitress, she always ended up returning to prostitution and a life of criminal activity. By the early 1950s, she had worked in bars, brothels and gambling establishments throughout California and had built up a substantial criminal record, including arrests for perjury, prostitution and narcotics possession. At this point, she had cultivated a number of friendships with ex-convicts and career criminals. She was arrested for providing a false alibi for 2 petty criminals and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. After her release, she once again tried a straight life, but soon found the world of waitressing far too dull for her. Yet again she returned to prostitution, and in 1953 she married a bartender named Henry Graham. He was a drug addict and hardened criminal. They soon had a son named Tommy. Henry introduced Barbara to many of his criminal friends, including Jack Santo and Emmett Perkins. Barbara soon began an affair with Emmett. This would lead to the downfall of them all. On March 8, 1953, Barbara Graham, her lover Emmett Perkins, Jack Santo, as well as John True and Baxter Shorter, were in high spirits having a dinner meeting at a local drive-in restaurant. The 5 were discussing their latest mark, a 64-year-old widow by the name of MABLE MONOH. MABLE was the ex-mother-in-law of Tuta Shearer, a millionaire Las Vegas gambler. The story circulating within criminal circles was that MABLE often stored money and jewels for her ex-son-in-law Tuta, with whom she had remained friends with after her daughter's divorce. It was rumoured that she stored $100,000 in the safe at her home, which could be readily accessed should Tuta ever need it. MABLE still lived in the home that Tuta and Iris once had shared. The spacious house was in a quiet, well-maintained residential neighbourhood in Burbank, about 12 miles north of Los Angeles. The gang had devised a plan to gain access to the house and rob MABLE of the money and jewels. The main hurdle in this plan was gaining access to the house, as despite the area's low crime rate, MABLE was anxious of living on her own with only her pet Labrador Ziggy and a kitten for company. A hardy row of decorative hedges surrounded the house on 3 sides. A 6-foot-tall concrete wall separated the back garden from the front, and the 2 gardens were separated by a gate which opened onto the driveway. This gate was always kept locked. MABLE installed large floodlights under the eaves of the house, which were always switched on when it was dark. There were deadbolts on all of the doors and safety latches on all of the windows. It is unknown where these fears came from. Was it purely a widow in her 60s feeling vulnerable, or something more sinister linked to her ex-son-in-law's high-rolling lifestyle and reputed mob connections? The evening of March 9, 1953 was mild and clear. As dusk turned to night, MABLE let her dog Ziggy out one last time before checking the doors and windows. She spoke to her friend Merle on the telephone before relaxing for the evening. Dressed in a blue print dress with a sweater to keep warm, Mabel settled down in a red leather chair to continue reading The Purple Pony Murders by Sidney T. Porcelain. The previous week, her daughter Iris Shearer Souder had returned to New York following an extended visit with her mother. At some point in the evening, breaking the silence, the doorbell rang. With Mabel's concern for safety and fear of living on her own, it would have presented her with a dilemma as to whether or not to open the door. She made her way slowly to the door. Mabel walked with a limp due to a car accident earlier in her life, which had brought her illustrious roller skating career to an end. The persistent ringing of the doorbell would surely have caused this frail, nervous old lady great anxiety due to the unexpected nature of this visit. When she reached the door, a pretty young woman who we know to have been Barbara told her that the car had broken down and asked if she could use the telephone to call a garage. Barbara appealed to Mabel as a vulnerable young woman and was extremely convincing of her plight to ensure that Mabel opened the door to her. As Mabel slowly unbolted the door, all hell broke loose. Barbara immediately smashed her back into the hallway with a vicious blow to the head. Barbara was followed in by Emmett Perkins, Jack Santo and John True, leaving Baxter Shorter, who was the safecracker, to act as lookout until the others located the safe. It was chaos in the house as the gang tore it apart searching for a safe. Furniture was ripped apart, cupboards were upended, wardrobes emptied, contents strewn and smashed everywhere. Eventually Jack Santo went outside to get Baxter Shorter and told him there was no safe. By the time Baxter entered the house, Mabel was on the floor in the hallway. There was blood everywhere and the quiet pain moans were muffled through a gag. At this point it is alleged that Barbara was encouraging the gang members to give her more, demanding that Mabel tell them where the money and jewels were hidden. Mabel refused to tell them anything. Eventually, realising that Mabel was not going to say anything, the gang began viciously pistol whipping this frail old lady, dragging her from room to room and trying to make her reveal the location of the safe. When it dawned on the gang that there was no safe, Mabel was suffocated with a pillow. Once the gang realised that their whole plan had fallen apart, they quickly left in the two cars in which they had arrived. Baxter Shorter and Jack Santo travelled in one with the remaining three in the other. Baxter told Jack that he intended to try to get help for the woman at the house, to which Jack replied that he didn't give a damn what Baxter did, as that woman had stopped breathing before they had left. When Baxter dropped Jack off at their meeting place, Jack warned him to keep his mouth shut or there would be dire consequences. Baxter then called to get an ambulance sent to help Mabel, but in his agitated state he gave the wrong address, so it never arrived. 2 days later, Mabel's gardener, Mitchell Truesdale, arrived at the old lady's house, ready to complete the week's gardening. Truesdale performed the same routine at each visit. He went to the front door where Mabel would give him the key for the back gate. When he arrived at the door, he was surprised to find it slightly ajar. He rang the doorbell several times before timidly pushing the door open. He immediately spotted trails of blood on both the floors and walls. He followed the trail and was horrified to find the battered body of his employer. Mabel was lying face down, half in and half out of a hallway closet. Her Labrador Ziggy was sitting whining by the back door. Truesdale immediately ran to a neighbour's house and called the police. Police Chief Rex Andrews was having lunch when he was informed that there had been a murder. Multiple officers were dispatched to the house, and upon arrival they found bloodstains in nearly every room and the house ransacked. Ironically, despite the gang leaving empty-handed, the police investigation revealed that a bag containing around $15,000 in jewels and valuables was in the closet where Mabel's body had been found. The first break in the case came when Baxter Shorter was arrested on another charge and made a deal with police to turn on the other gang members. He said he had been horrified to witness the murder and was undoubtedly terrified of being involved in the death penalty case. Details of Baxter's statement were leaked by someone close to the investigation. At that point, Baxter's days were numbered. Shortly after making his statement, Baxter Shorter was kidnapped at gunpoint from his Bunker Hill apartment and has never been seen or heard from since. His wife Olivia identified the two kidnappers as Emmett Perkins and Jack Santo. On June 3, 1953, Barbara Graham, Emmett Perkins, Jack Santo and John True were indicted by the county grand jury on charges of conspiracy to commit burglary, robbery and murder. At this point, John True decided to turn state evidence in exchange for his freedom. He was kept under police protection day and night because the prosecution could not afford to lose another witness. Barbara Graham continuously protested her innocence, but damaged her own defence when she offered a fellow inmate $25,000 to hire a friend to provide her with an alibi. The inmate was working with the police to negotiate a deal on her own sentence. Many saw this attempt at bribery as an indication of her guilt. However, Barbara continued to protest that it was an act of desperation. Jack Santo and Emmett Perkins also pleaded not guilty. At the trial, journalists focused on Barbara far more than her co-conspirators. Headlines referring to her appearance, makeup, clothes, demeanour were rife, whilst the same level of scrutiny was never applied to the male defendant. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before finding all 3 defendants guilty of the charges brought against them. There was no recommendation for life sentences. Their fates had been sealed. Following the sentencing, the trio returned to prison to await their ultimate punishment. As one of America's most glamorous death row inmates, journalists were still clamouring for a story about Barbara, whilst Emmett and Jack remained relatively ignored. Photographs were soon published of Barbara tearfully saying goodbye to her 20-month-old son, Tommy. The narrative of her story began to change from the femme fatale of the trial to the tragic beauty with the horrific upbringing. As this press narrative began to change, more people started to question exactly who was responsible for the death of MABLE MONOH. Although clearly involved in the crimes of that fateful night, was Barbara actually involved in the violent elements? Questions began to be asked. Could John True's version of events be believed? Had Emmett Perkins and Jack Santo decided to blame Barbara, believing that the state would never execute this beautiful young mother? Did Barbara strike the fatal blow and ultimately suffocate Mabel, or was John True simply trying to protect himself with this version of events? Would male gangsters in the 1950s really have bowed down to a female leader? Every one of the gang individually denied their guilt and blamed the others, but who is actually telling the truth? All of Barbara's appeals remained unsuccessful, and on June 2, 1955, Barbara was transferred to San Quentin State Prison. She was scheduled to be executed at 10 a.m. the following morning. When the time came, California Governor Goodwin J. Knight stayed the execution until 10:45 a.m. At 10:43 a.m, Knight once again stayed the execution until 11:30 a.m. Barbara protested, "Why do they torture me? I was ready to go at 10 o'clock. Many saw this treatment as inhumane. Finally, at 11:28 a.m, Barbara was led from her cell and strapped in the gas chamber. She requested a blindfold so that she would not have to look at the people observing. She was advised by the executioner that when the cyanide pellets were dropped, she should take a deep breath to make her death easier, to which she replied, "How the hell would you know?" She then uttered her last words, "Good people are always so sure they're right." Later that day at the same location, Emmett Perkins and Jack Santo were also executed. 1,180 days after Mabel MONOH was brutally beaten to death in her own home, Barbara Graham, Jack Santo and Emmett Perkins were executed for their role in that crime. Baxter Shorter had already been killed at the hands of his accomplices, Jack and Emmett. The only other person involved, John True, was released from custody with all charges against him dropped. We will never know exactly what happened in that Burbank house on the night of 9th March 1953 and whether those executed were guilty of Mabel's murder or did a murderer walk free. Thank you for listening to this case. I hope you've enjoyed my narration of this story and will hopefully join me for my weekly upload. Please click on the bell and the subscribe button and leave any comments or suggestions down below. Thank you once again for listening to The Crime Reel. Goodbye.